The knife had never once trembled in Juniper Calder's hand, not when she'd bone a whole hog at 14 years old to win her father's approval, not when she closed her own father's casket, because nobody else in the family could stand to do it. But on the night she found herself elbow deep in a stranger's kitchen, plating seared scallops for 40 guests in a mansion she had no business standing inside. Her hand went still over the cutting board the instant she saw a face she had spent 11 years trying to forget. He was laughing. He had a glass of bourbon in one hand, and another man's hand clapped warmly on his shoulder, and he laughed the easy, untroubled laugh of someone who had never once lost a night's sleep over anything he had done. Juniper had lost every night's sleep over what he'd done, and now he was seated at the head table, the most dangerous man in Brackenport, 15 feet from a pot of gumbo that smelled exactly like her father, and she had absolutely no idea how she was going to survive the evening without doing something she could never undo. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had seemed possible, because 3 weeks earlier, Juniper Calder had been standing in the walk-in cooler of her own failing restaurant, doing math that refused to add up no matter how many times she ran it. Calder's table had been her mother's name on the lease and her father's recipes on the menu, and for 6 years Juniper had kept both alive on sheer stubbornness, working 17-hour days, paying her 2 line cooks before she paid herself, watching the neighborhood gentrify around her at a pace that made her rent climb twice as fast as her revenue. The bank had stopped sending polite letters. The new ones used words like default and foreclosure, words that sat in her stomach like swallowed stones. And 3 states away, her younger brother Eli was 11 days into his second stint at a recovery facility that cost more per week than she paid herself in a month, and Juniper would have sold a kidney before she let him know how close they were to losing everything their parents had built. So when a voice she didn't recognize called her cell phone and offered $25,000 cash for a single private dinner, no questions, a non-disclosure agreement, a car that would pick her up with the windows blacked out, Juniper told herself it was only about the money. She would spend the next several days trying very hard to believe that was a whole truth. There had been a name on the contract, tucked into the fine print, where most caterers wouldn't bother to look. A holding company called Wexler Maritime Hospitality, registered to an estate on Hollow Point Road. Juniper had looked at that address for a long, long time before she signed. She told herself the flutter in her chest was nerves about the money. She did not tell herself out loud that she had spent the better part of the last year quietly chasing down every thread connected to the night her father died, that she had a folder in her closet thick with old pay stubs and newspaper clippings and the careful, slanted handwriting of a retired detective named Hollis Greer, who still owed her father a favor he'd never gotten to repay. She did not tell herself that the address on Hollow Point Road had appeared, twice now, in her father's old bank records from 11 years ago, paid out by a shell company she had never been able to trace. She told herself it was only about the money, and on the morning the blacked-out car arrived to take her to the address she had circled in red ink a dozen times, she climbed into the back seat and did not look back at the restaurant that bore her mother's lease and her father's name. The estate at Hollow Point Road did not look like danger. It looked like old money trying very hard to seem older, ivy strangling the brick in a way that had clearly been encouraged, a fountain shaped like a heron mid-flight, gravel raked so precisely it looked combed. A woman in her 50s met Juniper at the service entrance, sharp-eyed and economical with her words, introducing herself only as Marisol. "You'll have 4 hours," Marisol said, walking fast enough that Juniper had to lengthen her stride to keep up. 40 guests, 2 families, and Mr. Voss does not like surprises. Whatever you cook, it had better be perfect, because tonight is not the kind of night where second chances exist. She said it without cruelty, the way a person warns you about black ice on a road they drive every day, and Juniper understood, even before she stepped into the kitchen, that she had walked into something far larger than a catering job. The kitchen itself stopped her cold for half a second. Copper pots hanging in size order above a 6-burner range, blue Spanish tile climbing the backsplash, a window over the sink that looked out onto a courtyard garden gone slightly wild with rosemary. It was down to the placement of the spice rack, almost exactly the kitchen her father used to describe from a job he'd held briefly when she was a child, a private chef position he never talked about except to say it had paid well and ended badly. Juniper stood in the doorway a beat too long. Marisol noticed and said nothing, which Juniper would only understand the significance of much later. She had brought her own knives and her own plan, a seafood gumbo finished the way her father always finished it, with a single curl of orange peel dropped into the pot in the last 60 seconds of cooking, a trick he claimed his own grandmother taught him on a stove in a kitchen none of them had ever seen. It was not a fashionable dish for a mansion full of men in $3,000 suits, but it was the only thing Juniper knew how to cook when her hands needed something to believe in. And tonight, walking into a house that smelled like danger dressed up as hospitality, her hands needed exactly that. She met Adrian Voss for the first time at 5:40, while she was breaking down a case of Gulf shrimp, and he was apparently in the habit of inspecting his own kitchen before guests arrived. He didn't announce himself. She felt him before she saw him. The particular stillness of a room that had just acquired someone other people made room for, and when she turned around he was leaning in the doorway with his jacket already on and his tie not yet straightened, watching her hands work with an attention that felt entirely too personal for a man checking on his caterer. "You're the one with the gumbo," he said. "Not a question. I'm the one with several things," Juniper said. "But yes, gumbo's on the menu, if your house manager's brief was accurate about there being a Louisiana contingent among your guests tonight." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. He was younger than she'd expected for a man who made grown adults lower their voices in his hallways. Late 30s, dark hair silvering early at the temples, a stillness to him that reminded her of deep water, the kind that looks calm, because you can't see how far down it goes. "Calder," he said, reading the embroidery on her chef's coat. "Any relation to a Walter Calder?" The shrimp shell in her hand snapped cleanly in half. "He was my father," she said carefully. "Why?" "No reason," Adrian Voss said, too smoothly, and turned the conversation toward the menu as though he hadn't just asked a question that made the air in the room go thin. Juniper filed away the way she filed away every strange detail of that house. The kitchen too familiar, the holding company too coincidental, the man too interested, and told herself, again, that was only about the money. The guests began arriving at 7. Juniper watched them to the pass-through window between courses, a parade of expensive watches and careful smiles, men who laughed loudly and women who didn't laugh at all. Marisol murmured names as introductions happened in the front rooms, a habit Juniper suspected was less about helpfulness and more about a woman who had survived in that house a long time by knowing exactly who everyone was. There was Garen Wexler, the family's longtime consigliere, silver-haired and soft-spoken, who had a way of standing slightly behind Adrian's shoulder that made Juniper think of a man checking his work. There was Vivian Castellane, daughter of an allied family, poured into emerald silk, who looked at the kitchen staff the way some people looked at furniture. And there was a delegation from a rival operation, the Hallorans, Marisol said under her breath, here to discuss the shipping routes both families had been quietly killing each other over for 3 years, here tonight, supposedly to stop. It was 7:20, while Juniper was plating the second course, that a man walked through the dining room doors with a drink already in his hand, laughing at something one of the Halloran sons had said, and Juniper Calder's entire body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the walk-in cooler behind her. She knew that face. She had spent 11 years trying not to know it, and she knew it anyway, instantly, completely. The same square jaw, the same pale eyes, 11 years older and considerably better dressed, standing in a dining room laughing the way he had not laughed the night he stood in her family's front doorway with a gun in his hand. She had been 21 years old, hiding on the back stairs because her father had told her to run, and she had watched through the banister as that face appeared in the porch light a half-second before the gunshot that ended her father's life. She had given a description to the police that went nowhere. She had spent a decade believing she would recognize that face anywhere on earth, and she had been right. A serving tray slipped half an inch in her hands before she caught it. Marisol beside her said quietly, "Chef, you're white as a tablecloth." "I'm fine," Juniper said, in a voice that did not sound fine at all, and she made herself walk the gumbo out to the buffet table, because if she stood still one more second, she was going to do something with the carving knife in her apron pocket that would end this evening very differently than anyone in that room was expecting. She got through the next hour on muscle memory alone. She ladled gumbo into white bowls with hands that did not shake because she would not let them, and she watched the man who killed her father eat 3 bowls of it and call it the best thing he'd tasted in years, and something in her chest cracked so quietly that nobody at the table heard it but her. It was Adrian who noticed. He found her on the back terrace sometime after 9, where she'd slipped out under the excuse of checking the dessert station, gripping the stone railing hard enough to leave marks in her palms. He didn't ask if she was all right, which she appreciated more than she expected to. He just stood beside her, far enough not to crowd her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cool night air. "That gumbo," he said finally, "the orange peel at the end. My father used to talk about a chef who finished a dish like that. Said he never had it again after that man left our employ." He turned to look at her. "I think you should tell me who taught you to cook, Miss Calder." Juniper's throat went tight. "My father," she said. "He worked private events for a while when I was young. He never said for who." Adrian Voss looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like grief. "I think he worked for my family," he said quietly. "I think your father cooked in that kitchen behind us for almost 3 years. And I think something happened to him that I have spent the last 12 months trying to understand, because nobody in my family will tell me the truth, and I am very tired of being lied to in my own house." It was the most honest thing anyone in that mansion had said to her all night, and it terrified her more than the gun she'd seen in her father's doorway 11 years ago, because it meant the coincidence she'd been telling herself this job had never been a coincidence at all. Not for her, and apparently not for him either. Vivian Castellane found them like that, standing too close in the dark, and her voice cut across the terrace like a blade dragged over ice. "Adrian, darling, your guests are asking for you," she said, eyes flicking over Juniper from her flour-dusted shoes to her flushed face with an expression that needed no translation. "And you, sweetheart, I believe there's a kitchen somewhere that's missing its help." "She's not the help, Vivian. She's the reason half this table just had the best meal of their lives," Adrian said, in a tone mild enough to be polite and sharp enough to draw blood, and walked back inside without another word, leaving Vivian's perfectly painted smile to curdle in the porch light. Juniper, despite everything, despite the dead man's killer sitting at that table and her chest still cracked open from an hour ago, felt something unfamiliar and unwelcome bloom under her ribs. She did not have time, tonight, to examine what it was. She didn't get the chance, because 40 minutes later, restless and unable to settle back into the rhythm of dessert plating, she found herself drawn down a hallway she had no business walking down, toward a study door left slightly open, toward a folder sitting open on a mahogany desk with her own name typed across the tab. Her hands found it before her brain caught up to what she was doing. Inside were photographs herself, leaving Calder's table on 3 separate evenings, a printout of her restaurant's lease history, a copy of her father's death certificate, and a single handwritten note in a careful hand. Confirmed before contract. "Do not let her connect Wexler Holdings to the Hollow Point property until I understand what she knows." Juniper's stomach dropped through the floor. She had spent 3 weeks convincing herself she had outsmarted a mansion full of dangerous men by chasing her own private investigation under their noses, and the entire time it appeared she had been the one being watched, studied, and quietly reeled in like a fish that hadn't yet noticed the hook. "You weren't supposed to see that." Adrian's voice came from the doorway, low and careful, and when Juniper turned around there was no point pretending. The folder was still open in her hands. "How long?" she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Have you known who I am?" He didn't lie to her, which she would later understand was a single thing that saved whatever was growing between them. "Since the week after my father's funeral," he said. "I found records in his private safe. Payments to a Walter Calder that stopped abruptly 11 years ago, the same month the man my family employed, my own brother's man, disappeared from our payroll. I didn't know what it meant. I started pulling threads, and every thread led to your restaurant in your face, and I told myself I was investigating my family's past." He stepped further into the room, and something in his composure finally slipped. "I told myself that for months, Juniper, right up until Gal 4 months ago, where I watched you argue with a delivery driver in an alley behind a hotel ballroom, and I realized I had stopped being able to tell the difference between investigating and wanting to see you again." "That's not an apology," Juniper said, though her chest had gone tight and aching in a way that had nothing to do with anger anymore. "No," he agreed. "It's not. I don't think I owe you one for finding out the truth. I think I owe you one for not telling you the moment I learned it, and for letting you walk into this house tonight without warning you who might be sitting at that table." He paused, and his next words came out rougher, like something dragged up from a place he didn't visit often. "I have a brother, Juniper. Had. Mateo. Older than me. Supposed to inherit everything before he didn't. My father told the family he left for Europe 11 years ago and never spoke his name again. I have spent a year learning that isn't true, and I think your father died because of whatever my brother did, and I think I owe you the truth more than I owe my family their silence." The room had gone very quiet. Outside the study door, faintly, Juniper could hear the clink of glasses, a ripple of laughter from the dining room. The ordinary sounds of 40 people enjoying an evening that had no idea it was sitting on top of a grave. "It wasn't your brother who killed him," she said finally, and watched the words land on Adrian Voss like a physical blow. "I was there. I was 21 years old, and I was hiding on the stairs, and I saw the man who pulled the trigger. He's downstairs right now, eating my father's gumbo and telling jokes to your Halloran guests. His name was Roan. I've spent a year finding out he goes by Roan Sykes now, and that he works with family currently sitting at your dinner table." Adrian Voss went very, very still. "Sykes," he repeated, and something cold moved across his face that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Sykes was my brother's man. He worked security detail for Mateo for 2 years before Mateo disappeared." He looked at Juniper with an expression she would later describe as the moment a man's entire understanding of his own family rearranges itself in real time. He didn't defect to the Hallorans after Mateo left. He ran to them, because somebody needed him gone from this house before he could ever be asked what he knew. It was Garen Wexler's voice, 3 minutes later, that ended any illusion that the two of them had time to sit quietly with what they'd just learned. He found them in the study with the kind of soft, unhurried knock that men use when they already know they're interrupting something, and his face, when Juniper looked at it now, carried none of the warm avuncular ease it had worn over dinner. "Adrian," he said, "a word. Privately, if you don't mind the chef stepping out." "She stays," Adrian said. Garen's eyes flicked to the open folder on the desk, to Juniper's name on the tab, and something in his expression shifted with the speed of a man recalculating an entire evening's plan. "I see," he said softly. "That's unfortunate timing." It was a word unfortunate, more than anything else, that told Juniper years of kitchen instinct. The same instinct that told her when a sauce was about to break before it broke, that the next 30 seconds of her life were going to be very dangerous. And she was right, because Garen Wexler's hand came out of his jacket, holding something that was not, in fact, a handkerchief. "You spent a year digging through your father's old business, while I spent 11 years building a wall around the fact that I'm the one who told your brother pull that trigger, Adrian," Garen said, and his voice had lost every trace of warmth. "Walter Calder found the manifests, found out what we were really shipping under your father's flag, and threatened to take it to the police rather than keep cooking dinner for the men running it. Mateo panicked the way young men with too much to prove always do, and I helped him panic correctly. Your father found out the truth 8 months later, and I told him Mateo had acted alone, gone rogue, needed to be removed for the family's protection. And your father believed me, because by then I'd been the only honest voice in his ear for 30 years. His knuckles went white around the gun. I am not about to let a chef and a grieving son undo 3 decades of careful work in one evening. What happened next happened fast enough that Juniper would only be able to reconstruct it later in fragments. The lights in the hallway cutting out as someone, somewhere, killed the breaker. The sound of raised voices and overturned chairs rolling down the corridor from the dining room. Marisol's voice shouting something in Spanish that Juniper didn't need translated to understand was a warning. Garen's attention split for half a second toward the noise, and in that half second Adrian moved, putting his body between Juniper and the gun with a speed that suggested this was not the first time in his life he'd had to make that calculation. The shot that followed went into the bookshelf instead of either of them, and then Dante, Adrian's head of security, a wall of the man Juniper had seen posted at the front gate, came through the study door and put Garen Wexler on the floor with one motion that ended the question of the gun entirely. The dining room, when they reached it, was chaos in particular, contained way that dangerous men make chaos look orderly. Roan Sykes was on his feet, a knife in his hand that he had clearly intended for someone's throat before Dante's men reached him first. his easy laugh from earlier in the evening completely gone, replaced by the snarling panic of a man who had just heard his own name attached to a murder he thought had been buried for over a decade. Old man Halloran himself, gray-haired and granite-faced at the head of his delegation, rose from his chair with a fury that made the whole room go still. "You came into this house under my banner," Halloran said to Sykes, in a voice that carried a particular way of a man about to make a decision that would outlive everyone in the room. "And you nearly started a war I did not authorize, over a murder you committed before you ever worked for me, that I never knew about and would never have sanctioned." He looked at Adrian, then, with something that might have been respect. "He's yours, Voss. Take him to whoever can make this legal. I won't have my family's name attached to whatever Wexler was running here tonight, and I won't have it attached to a man who shoots fathers in their own doorways for catching him in a lie." It was Adrian who made the choice that surprised everyone in that room, including Juniper, including, she suspected, himself. He did not have Roan Sykes killed quietly in a basement the way every story she'd ever heard about families like it suggested he would. He had Dante's men hold him until two of Hollis Greer's old contacts in the state police arrived, quietly, through the server's entrance, with a folder of evidence Adrian had apparently been assembling for exactly this purpose for longer than he'd let himself admit, even to her, even in that study an hour ago. "My father ran this family on silence," Adrian said to her, much later, once the house had finally emptied and the gravel drive had gone quiet again. "I'm not interested in running it on silence anymore. Your father deserves a courtroom, Juniper, not another quiet grave in this family's history." It took 3 months of the case to work through the system. 3 months in which Juniper testified, in which Hollis Greer's decade-old notes turned out to be exactly thorough enough to matter, in which Roan Sykes' own former associates, eager to distance themselves from a scandal that had nearly dragged 2 families into open war, found themselves remarkably willing to corroborate details they kept quiet for years. Garen Wexler never stood trial. The version of events that survived him afterward made it clear enough what kind of man he'd been to almost everyone who needed to know. Juniper sat in the back of a courtroom on a gray Tuesday morning and watched the man who had stood in her father's doorway 11 years ago get sentenced to a number of years that would outlast what was left of his life. And she did not feel triumphant, exactly. She felt, for the first time in over a decade, that she could finally put the knife down. Calder's table reopened that spring with a line out the door that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with the dock workers from Voss Maritime who had started eating there on their lunch breaks and never stopped. Word spreading the on-his-way word spreads about good food made by someone who means it. Eli came home from his second stay clean in a way that finally felt like it might hold, and Juniper gave him a job running the front of house because she had learned, finally, that loving someone sometimes meant letting them stand on their own 2 feet. Instead of carrying them. Vivian Castellane married into a shipping fortune 2 states over and sent, of all things, a genuinely gracious note when she heard the news about Adrian, which Juniper kept, slightly bewildered, in a kitchen drawer she never quite got around to clearing out. Adrian came by Calder's table on a Thursday evening in late spring, after the dinner rush had thinned to its last few tables, and slid onto a stool at the kitchen counter the way he had never once sat in his own dining room. "Voss Maritime's dropping the shipping lanes that started this whole mess," he told her, watching her plate a bowl of gumbo she hadn't been asked to make. "Going legitimate, slower, less profitable, considerably less likely to get anyone killed. My father would have hated it." He looked up at her with something easy and unguarded in his face that she had never once seen across that long dinner table on the night they met. "I think I'm finally all right with that." Juniper set the bowl down in front of him, finished, as always, with a single curl of orange peel dropped in during the last 60 seconds of cooking, the way her father had taught her, the way his own father had once loved without ever knowing why. "My dad used to say," she said, sliding onto the stool beside him, "that the secret to a good gumbo is knowing exactly when to stop adding things to it, when it's already enough." Adrian Voss tasted it, closed his eyes for one long, quiet moment, and reached over to take her hand on the counter between them. And for the first time in 11 years, Juniper Calder let someone hold it without flinching.